Parker Steele sat in his vast office, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Houston skyline like a portrait of his empire. His desk, made of rare mahogany, was scattered with reports, oil contracts, and financial statements. Yet, as Parker stared out over the city he had conquered, he couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered within him, a shadow that all the success in the world couldn't seem to erase. At 56, Parker Steele was a name that dominated the oil industry. Every deal he made sent shockwaves through global markets, and his wealth afforded him luxuries few could imagine. Private jets, sprawling estates, and the respect, or rather, the fear, of those in the corporate world. But Parker knew the truth. Underneath the layers of success and power, he was a man who had sacrificed everything personal for the empire he now controlled. His relationships had been few, and those that mattered had long crumbled under the pressure of his relentless ambition. A failed marriage, a daughter he hadn't spoken to in years, and a string of fleeting romances that always ended the same. Him choosing business over them. Even as he sat alone in his massive office, surrounded by symbols of his achievements, Parker felt the weight of the solitude pressing down on him. A sharp knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice rough and used from the hours of silence. "Sir, your car is ready," a young voice said from the doorway. It was Dylan, one of the company's drivers. Barely in his 20s, the kid had been working for Steel Oil for only a few months but had already made an impression. Parker had noticed how the kid was always observing, always listening, like he was learning with every second spent in the corporate halls. Parker waved him off, but something about the boy made him pause. There was an intensity in Dylan's gaze, a hunger that reminded Parker of his younger self. He had started out just like that, driven, hungry, ready to do whatever it took to rise. And maybe that was what intrigued him now. In a world filled with seasoned professionals who gave him nothing but rehearsed speeches, this kid stood out, raw and ambitious. "You, Dylan, right?" Parker asked, leaning back in his chair, scrutinizing the young man. Dylan straightened up, surprised that the magnate had remembered his name. "Yes, sir. How long have you been driving for us?" 3 months, sir." Parker nodded, considering. "You like it here?" Dylan hesitated, then said, "It's a great opportunity, sir." "But," he trailed off, clearly unsure of how much to say. "But," Parker pressed, raising an eyebrow. I want to do more. Learn more. Not just drive." That caught Parker's attention. He studied the boy, seeing the raw ambition simmering just below the surface. It reminded him of himself all those years ago, before the weight of his choices began to take their toll. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You know, Dylan, I didn't start with much more than you have now," Parker began, his voice low and thoughtful. "But I clawed my way up. That takes something. Something more than what most people are willing to give." Dylan stood there, eyes locked on Parker, listening intently. "Tell you what," Parker continued, standing up from his chair and moving around the desk. "I'm heading to a meeting with some investors. Why don't you drive me, and we'll talk about what more you want to learn?" The young driver's eyes widened, clearly not expecting that offer. "Yes, sir. Absolutely," Dylan said, trying to keep the excitement from spilling out. As they walked toward the elevator, Parker could feel something shift within him. Maybe it was a fleeting moment of nostalgia, seeing a younger version of himself in Dylan. Or maybe it was just the thought that, for once, he could shape someone's future in a way that didn't end in the same lonely path he had walked. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft chime. Parker glanced at Dylan from the corner of his eye. "Tell me, Dylan," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "how far are you willing to go?" As the young driver turned to answer, Parker could feel the faint stirrings of something new, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The sleek, black sedan glided through the crowded streets of Houston, weaving effortlessly between traffic. Parker Steele sat in the back, silently observing the young man at the wheel. Dylan, though clearly nervous, handled the car with precision. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror occasionally, as if waiting for Parker to speak. But for the first few minutes, the powerful oil magnate said nothing. Finally, Parker leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on the back of Dylan's head. "You said you want to learn more," Parker began, his voice calm but sharp. What exactly are you looking to learn? Dylan hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. I want to understand how things work here, sir. Not just driving, but how the business is run, how decisions are made. I want to learn from someone like you. Parker's eyes narrowed, his thoughts racing. It was the same ambition he had once seen in himself, a burning desire to climb the ladder, to be more than just another cog in the machine. But Parker knew that ambition came at a price, one he had paid many times over. Someone like me? Parker repeated, his tone carrying an edge of cynicism. And why is that? Dylan glanced in the mirror again, meeting Parker's gaze briefly before looking back at the road. Because you built all of this, from the ground up. There's no one better to learn from. Parker leaned back, his thoughts drifting to the years of relentless work, the sleepless nights, the betrayals and broken promises. Could he really pass on what he knew? And more importantly, did he even want to? He studied Dylan for a moment longer before speaking again. You think you can handle the pressure? Parker asked, his voice dropping to a lower, almost menacing tone. You think you're ready to deal with what it really takes to run a business like Steel Oil? It's not just about money, Dylan. It's about survival. Dylan didn't hesitate this time. Yes, sir. I'm ready. Parker smirked, leaning forward again. We'll see about that. The car pulled into the parking garage of a towering downtown skyscraper. Parker glanced out the window as they came to a stop. You'll sit in on this meeting, Parker said casually. Listen, learn, and don't speak unless spoken to. Dylan's heart raced as he parked the car, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He was about to step into a world he had only dreamed of, a world of power, influence, and dangerous deals. As they stepped out of the car and headed toward the elevator, Dylan kept his eyes focused forward, trying to contain his nerves. The conference room on the 40th floor was sleek and modern, with glass walls overlooking the city. Several men were already seated at the long table, their expensive suits and cold expressions exuding wealth and control. They all stood when Parker entered the room, their voices falling into hushed tones. Gentlemen, Parker said, his voice smooth and commanding as he took his seat at the head of the table. Dylan stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of where to go until Parker gestured to an empty seat near the back. As the meeting began, Parker's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the quiet, reflective man Dylan had spoken to in the car. Now, he was sharp, cutting through negotiations with precision, dominating the conversation with an intensity that made even the most seasoned investors lean back in their chairs. Dylan tried to follow along, but the jargon and sheer complexity of the deals being discussed left him struggling to keep up. At one point, one of the investors, an older man with silver hair and a hawk-like expression, turned to Parker with a question that seemed to carry hidden weight. You've heard the rumors, haven't you, Steele? There's been talk about new players entering the field. Disruptors. Parker's jaw clenched, but his expression remained neutral. Rumors are just that, rumors. We deal in facts here. And the fact is, Steel Oil is untouchable. The silver-haired man smirked, leaning back in his chair. For now, perhaps. But new blood is coming, Parker. You can't keep them out forever. Dylan felt the tension in the room tighten like a noose. He glanced at Parker, who seemed unfazed by the veiled threat, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Anger, or perhaps fear. After the meeting concluded, Parker stood, shaking hands with the investors as they filtered out of the room. Dylan stayed seated, his mind still reeling from everything he had witnessed. As the last man left, Parker turned to Dylan. Did you catch all that? Parker asked, his voice flat. I think so, sir, Dylan stammered. Parker chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. What you heard in there, that's the world you want to be part of. Cutthroat, ruthless. You're either on top or you're nothing. Dylan swallowed hard, nodding. I understand, but Parker wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. This industry, it's not for the faint of heart. People will try to ruin you, and if you're not careful, they will. Trust is a luxury you can't afford. Dylan nodded again, but inside, doubt began to creep in. He had always imagined the corporate world as one of power and prestige, but now it felt more like a battlefield, where every move could mean life or death for a career. As they rode the elevator back down to the garage, Parker's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face tightening as he read the message. "Change of plans," Parker muttered. "We're making a detour." Dylan looked over at him. "Where to, sir?" Parker's eyes darkened. To see someone who might just be the first crack in this empire. As they got back into the car, Dylan could feel the tension growing. He wasn't sure where they were headed or what was about to happen, but one thing was clear. Whatever it was going to change everything. Dylan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, the silence in the car thick with tension. He glanced at Parker in the rearview mirror, but the oil magnate's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the phone in his hand. The car sped through Houston's streets, leaving the corporate towers and wealth behind, as they headed toward the industrial outskirts of the city. "Where are we going, sir?" Dylan finally asked, unable to bear the quiet any longer. Parker didn't look up. "To meet someone," he said, his voice sharp. "Someone I thought I could trust." The words hung in the air, sending a chill down Dylan's spine. Whoever they were about to meet wasn't just a business associate. There was something personal about the way Parker said it, something that made Dylan uneasy. As they drove deeper into the industrial zone, the skyscrapers gave way to warehouses, factories, and sprawling oil refineries. The landscape was gray and barren, the scent of oil and machinery hanging heavy in the air. Dylan had never been to this part of town. This was where the deals happened behind closed doors, far from the gleaming offices of downtown Houston. Parker finally looked up from his phone, gesturing toward an unmarked building at the end of a long, desolate road. "There. Pull in." Dylan obeyed, turning the car down the narrow alley that led to the building. The place looked abandoned, its windows dirty and cracked, its exterior battered by years of neglect. It didn't seem like the kind of place someone like Parker Steele would do business. As the car came to a stop, Parker opened the door before Dylan could rush around to assist. "Stay in the car," Parker said firmly. "This won't take long." Dylan watched as Parker strode toward the building, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading afternoon light. The door creaked open, and Parker disappeared inside, leaving Dylan alone with his thoughts. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Dylan's anxiety grew with each passing second. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of meeting this was. Was Parker confronting an enemy? A rival? Or was this about something deeper? The way Parker had spoken earlier suggested betrayal, and that was a dangerous game in their world. Dylan shifted in his seat, glancing nervously at the building. The uncertainty gnawed at him. His ambition had brought him here, close to the man who controlled everything he wanted to learn. But now he was beginning to realize that Parker Steele's world was far more treacherous than he'd imagined. Suddenly, the door to the building burst open. Parker emerged, his face set in stone, his shoulders tense. Behind him, a man followed, tall, wiry, with graying hair and an air of authority. Dylan recognized him instantly. Roger Whitman, one of Steel Oil's top executives, someone Parker had worked with for decades. The man was practically a fixture in the company, known for his loyalty and sharp business mind. But something about the way Parker was walking told Dylan that loyalty had just been shattered. Parker's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Get in the car." Roger didn't argue. He slipped into the back seat beside Parker, and Dylan started the engine, his heart pounding. As the car pulled away from the building, the tension inside was suffocating. For a few moments, no one spoke. Dylan could feel the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. He wasn't sure what Parker had uncovered, but it was clear something serious had gone down. Finally, Parker turned to Roger, his voice cold and controlled. "I gave you everything. 25 years of loyalty. And this is how you repay me?" Roger remained silent, his eyes staring straight ahead. The man's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Parker's anger. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" Parker continued, his voice rising slightly. "Did you think you could move against me and I wouldn't notice?" Dylan's hands trembled slightly on the wheel. Whatever this was, it was big. His mind raced, trying to piece together what could possibly make Parker this furious. Roger had been one of his closest allies, someone he trusted to help run Steel Oil. What had gone wrong? "I didn't move against you, Parker," Roger finally said, his voice steady but weary. "I moved to protect us." "Protect you?" Parker's laugh was cold and bitter. "Protect me? Is that what you call it? Undermining my decisions behind my back? Selling information to people who would love nothing more than to watch me burn? That's protection?" Dylan's stomach churned. Selling information? Was that what this was about? Corporate espionage? He couldn't believe it. Not from someone like Roger. And yet, here they were. "You don't see it, Parker," Roger said, turning to face him for the first time, his expression hard. "You've been so focused on keeping everything under your control that you've ignored what's coming. The world is changing. The energy sector is changing. There are forces moving against you, against us, that you can't even comprehend. I did what I had to do to survive." "To survive?" Parker seethed. "You betrayed me to save yourself. That's the truth, isn't it? You couldn't stomach the idea that I was still calling the shots, so you decided to make your own moves." Roger shook his head. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," Parker snapped. "You let your fear cloud your judgment. And now, you've put everything we've built at risk." The car fell silent again, the weight of Parker's words hanging heavily. Dylan's heart was racing as he tried to process everything he was hearing. He had known that Steel Oil was a cutthroat business, but this was a whole new level of treachery. It wasn't just about money or power anymore. This was personal. Roger leaned back in his seat, his voice quieter now. "I've always been loyal to you, Parker, but you've lost sight of what's important. The world doesn't revolve around Steel Oil anymore. If we don't adapt, we're going to lose everything." Parker's eyes burned with fury. "No, Roger. You're the one who's going to lose everything. Get out." Dylan's breath caught as Parker's words sliced through the tension like a knife. Roger hesitated, but when he saw the look in Parker's eyes, he didn't argue. He opened the door and stepped out onto the side of the road. Parker didn't even glance back as the car pulled away, leaving Roger standing alone in the dust. As they drove in silence, Dylan's mind spun. He had just witnessed the kind of power struggle that most people only read about, and he had no idea how deep the betrayal ran or what Parker planned to do next. But one thing was clear: this was far from over. Parker finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Remember this, Dylan," he said, his gaze fixed out the window. "In this business, the people closest to you are the ones who can do the most damage. You trust no one." "Not fully." Dylan nodded, the lesson sinking in deeper than anything else Parker had taught him so far. This wasn't just business. This was survival. As the car sped through the empty streets, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath them was shifting, and that soon, everything would come crashing down. The tension in the air still hung thick as Dylan drove back toward the city, Parker silent in the back seat, his eyes staring into the distance. The confrontation with Roger had left a deep mark, not just on the older man, but on Parker himself. Dylan could sense it. This was more than just another betrayal. There was something more personal here, something raw. Dylan stole a glance in the rearview mirror. Parker's face was expressionless, but his mind was clearly racing. The silence between them felt like the calm before a storm, the kind that could tear apart anything in its path. As they approached Steel Oil's headquarters, Parker finally spoke, his voice cold and steady. "You're coming with me," he said, as if the decision had already been made. Dylan didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to say. "To where, sir?" he asked cautiously. Parker's eyes flicked toward the window. "You'll see soon enough." They pulled into the underground garage beneath the towering building, the security gates closing behind them with a soft clang. Dylan parked the car in Parker's reserved spot, and before he could say another word, Parker was already out, striding toward a private elevator. Dylan hurried after him. The elevator ride was silent, the hum of machinery the only sound as they ascended to the upper floors. When the doors slid open, Dylan found himself in a part of Steel Oil he had never seen before. This wasn't the executive suite or the conference rooms filled with glass and chrome. This was the nerve center, the heart of Parker Steel's empire. A long hallway stretched before them, lined with dark wood and expensive artwork. At the end of it, a pair of large, imposing doors loomed like the entrance to a fortress. Without a word, Parker pushed them open, and Dylan followed him into a room unlike any he had ever imagined. It was massive, larger than any office Dylan had ever seen. The far wall was a massive digital display, filled with real-time data, stock prices, oil reserves, and global market trends. The rest of the room was sleek and minimalist, with a long black conference table in the center and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city. But what caught Dylan's attention was the large, polished steel vault built into the far wall. It looked out of place in such a modern office, like something from a bygone era. Parker walked straight toward it, his movements precise and controlled. With a quick tap of his finger on a hidden panel, the vault door slid open, revealing shelves of meticulously organized files and documents. Dylan's curiosity piqued. This wasn't the kind of vault that held money or jewels. This was where Parker Steele kept his real treasures. The secrets, the leverage, the information. Parker glanced over his shoulder at Dylan, as if reading his thoughts. "Everything you need to destroy someone is in here," he said flatly. "And in this business, you need to know when to use it." Dylan felt a chill run down his spine as Parker began pulling out a series of files, each one thicker than the last. He placed them on the table, one by one, until there were at least half a dozen stacked in front of him. "These," Parker said, tapping the top file, "are the people who think they can challenge me. Competitors, rivals, even former allies like Roger. They all have something to hide." Dylan's eyes widened as Parker flipped open the first file. It was a detailed dossier, filled with photographs, personal records, financial statements, and notes in Parker's own handwriting. Everything from illicit deals to hidden offshore accounts. This was blackmail material of the highest order. Parker continued speaking, his tone cold and clinical. "Roger's mistake wasn't just that he betrayed me. It's that he underestimated me. He thought I wouldn't have insurance, wouldn't know what he was planning. But I always know." He closed the file with a snap and fixed his gaze on Dylan. "If you're serious about learning, you need to understand this. Power isn't just about making deals or having the most money. It's about control. And control comes from knowing everything. Everyone has a weakness, Dylan. Everyone. And if you know what it is, you can make them dance to your tune." Dylan swallowed hard, the enormity of what Parker was saying sinking in. This wasn't the world he had imagined when he'd first joined Steel Oil. This wasn't just business. This was a ruthless, calculated game of survival, where information was the deadliest weapon. "You think you're ready for this?" Parker asked, his eyes boring into Dylan's with an intensity that made the younger man's heart race. I don't know, sir," Dylan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth. The ambition that had once burned so brightly inside him now felt tainted, weighed down by the reality of what it would cost. Parker gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That's the right answer. Anyone who says they're ready for this is either lying or a fool." Parker closed the vault door with a soft hiss and motioned for Dylan to follow him to the windows. The sun was beginning to set, casting the city in a warm, golden glow. It was a stark contrast to the cold, calculated decisions being made inside this room. "For years, I've built this empire," Parker said, his voice softer now. "But no matter how much power you have, there's always someone waiting to take it from you. People like Roger. People who think they can take a piece of what I've earned." He turned to face Dylan, his expression unreadable. "That's where you come in." Dylan blinked, confused. "Me, sir?" Parker nodded. "I need someone who can see things from the ground level. Someone who isn't entrenched in this world yet. Someone who can move without attracting attention. You've got the potential, Dylan. I see it in you. The question is, how far are you willing to go?" Dylan felt his heart pounding in his chest. The offer, if that's what it was both thrilling and terrifying. This was his chance to be more than just a driver. This was his shot at stepping into Parker Steele's world, into the inner circle. But he also knew what that meant. There was no turning back from this. Before Dylan could respond, Parker's phone buzzed, the harsh sound breaking the silence. Parker glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. Without a word, he strode back to his desk and answered the call. "What is it?" Parker barked into the phone. His face hardened as he listened, the tension in the room spiking once more. "What do you mean they pulled out?" he hissed. pacing the length of the room. "I don't care what the projections say. We had a deal." Dylan watched as Parker's calm exterior began to crack. Whoever was on the other end of the line wasn't just some investor. They were someone with enough power to make Parker Steele sweat. "No, listen to me," Parker growled, his voice low and dangerous. "If you back out now, it won't just be your company that suffers. You'll regret it." He slammed the phone down, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. Dylan stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Parker turned toward him, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get the car ready. We're going to pay a visit to someone who thinks they can play games with me." Dylan nodded quickly, turning to leave the office. As he walked down the long hallway toward the elevator, his mind raced with everything he had just witnessed. He had wanted to be part of this world, to learn from Parker Steele, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and the man he had looked up to was more dangerous than he had realized. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Dylan knew one thing for sure. Whatever was about to happen next, it was going to push him deeper into a world he wasn't sure he was ready for. Dylan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the car sped through Houston's night streets. The city lights blurred past them, casting an eerie glow on the asphalt. Parker sat in the back, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, venomous tones to someone on the other end. Dylan couldn't make out the words, but the tension in Parker's voice was unmistakable. The events of the past few hours raced through Dylan's mind. He had watched Parker confront one of his closest allies, witnessed the betrayal, and been dragged deeper into the twisted, high-stakes world of Steel Oil. And now, they were heading into something even darker. Parker ended the call with a snap and leaned forward slightly, his gaze burning into Dylan's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Do you know what separates people like me from the rest?" Parker asked, his voice low but commanding. Dylan swallowed hard. "No, sir." Parker's lips curled into a grim smile. "It's knowing when to strike. Timing. Most people act out of emotion, out of fear. But to stay on top, you have to think 5 moves ahead. Always be in control." Dylan nodded, unsure of what to say. He could feel the intensity radiating off Parker, the pressure of the situation bearing down on both of them. The car turned down a narrow street in one of the more secluded parts of town, far from the gleaming skyscrapers and wealth of downtown. They pulled up in front of a modest, unassuming office building. The place didn't look like the center of any major business dealings, but Dylan had learned that appearances meant nothing in Parker Steele's world. "We're here," Parker said, his voice clipped. "You're coming inside with me this time." Dylan felt a rush of nerves but nodded. He turned off the engine and stepped out, following Parker as they approached the building's entrance. The doors swung open almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting for them. A large, burly man with a shaved head stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Steele," the man greeted, stepping aside to let them in. Parker didn't respond. He strode inside without hesitation, his presence dominating the room even though they were far from Steel Oil's polished corporate offices. Dylan trailed behind, keeping his eyes alert and trying to make sense of what was happening. They were led through a series of dimly lit hallways until they reached a small, windowless room. Inside, 3 men sat around a table, all of them turning toward Parker as he entered. Their faces were hard, weathered by years of rough business. These weren't boardroom executives. They were something else entirely. Dylan could feel the danger in the room, thick and palpable. "Steele," one of the men said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table. "You've got some nerve showing up here after what happened." Parker didn't flinch. "Cut the theatrics, Marconi," he said, his voice icy. "We had a deal." Marconi, clearly the leader of the group, smirked. "Deals change, Steele. You know that better than anyone. Besides, it's not just up to me." The others had concerns about the risks. "Your position isn't as untouchable as it once was." Dylan's heart pounded as he stood just behind Parker, watching the exchange unfold. He had no idea who these men were, but it was clear they held a significant amount of leverage in whatever deal Parker had made. This wasn't about board meetings or stock prices anymore. This felt like the kind of business that didn't leave paper trails. Parker stepped closer to the table, his presence dark and imposing. "The risks?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "You're worried about risks? Let me tell you something, Marconi. Without me, you don't even get in the game. You think you can pull out now and walk away unscathed?" Marconi's smirk faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You can't threaten us, Steele. Not here. Not in this game." Parker's eyes blazed, but his voice remained calm and measured. "This isn't a threat. It's a reality check. You know who I am. You know what I'm capable of. If you back out now, it won't be just your reputation that takes a hit. It'll be everything. I'll bury you so deep, no one will even remember you existed." The room fell into a tense silence, the air crackling with the unspoken danger between the men. Dylan could feel his pulse racing, the weight of what was happening pressing down on him like a vice. After a long pause, Marconi leaned forward, his face hardening. "You're playing with fire, Steele." "I've been playing with fire my entire life," Parker shot back, his voice deadly. "And I'm still here." For a moment, it looked like Marconi might stand down. But just as the tension seemed to ease, one of the other men at the table, a younger guy with slicked back hair and a sharp, cold expression, spoke up. "We're not backing out because of the risks, Steele," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We're backing out because we found someone else. Someone who's offering more." Parker's face went stone cold. "Who?" he demanded, his tone dangerous. The younger man smiled, leaning back in his chair. "You know exactly who. You've been losing ground, Steele. People are starting to see cracks in your empire. And when they do, they look for new alliances. New leaders." Parker's fists clenched at his sides, and Dylan could sense the storm brewing inside him. Whoever these men were aligning with, it was someone powerful enough to make even Parker Steele lose control, at least for a moment. "I wouldn't get too comfortable with your new friends," Parker said through gritted teeth. "They won't last long." Marconi stood, clearly signaling the end of the conversation. "We're done here, Steele. Unless you've got something else to offer, we're moving forward without you." Parker didn't respond immediately. He stared down Marconi, his eyes burning with a fury Dylan had never seen before. But then, in a move that surprised everyone in the room, Parker straightened up and smiled. A cold, calculating smile. "I do have something else," Parker said smoothly. "Something I think you'll want to see." Marconi and the others exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the sudden shift in Parker's demeanor. Without waiting for their response, Parker pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and held it up for the men to see. On the screen was a video, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Marconi and the younger man in a private meeting with someone Dylan didn't recognize. They were discussing terms, shaking hands, sealing a deal. But it wasn't just any deal. It was a betrayal, clear and undeniable. The color drained from Marconi's face as he watched the video play out. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely concealed rage. Parker's smile widened. "I told you. I always know." Marconi's expression hardened, but he was cornered. The other men shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had been outmaneuvered. The balance of power had shifted back to Parker in an instant. "Now," Parker continued, his voice cold and authoritative, "you have two choices. You either honor our original agreement, or this video finds its way to every competitor, client, and business partner you've ever worked with. Your credibility, your entire operation, will be wiped out in less than a day." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Marconi's fists clenched, but he knew he was beaten. After a long, agonizing pause, he gave a stiff nod. "Fine. The deal stands." Parker's smile faded, replaced by the icy composure he was known for. "Good. I expect everything in order by tomorrow." Without another word, Parker turned on his heel and walked out of the room, Dylan following close behind. As they stepped back into the cool night air, Parker's expression remained unreadable. Dylan was still trying to process what he had just witnessed. The way Parker had manipulated the situation, turned the tables so effortlessly. It was terrifying and brilliant all at once. They got back into the car, and as Dylan started the engine, he couldn't help but ask, "How did you know they were going to back out?" Parker's eyes flicked toward him, a ghost of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. I always have eyes and ears where they matter. That's the first rule, Dylan. You don't just plan for what's in front of you. You plan for what's coming, for what people are hiding. As the car pulled away, Dylan realized that Parker Steele wasn't just a businessman. He was a master of survival, a man who controlled everything and everyone around him. And if Dylan wanted to survive in this world, he'd have to learn fast. Because in Parker's world, there was no room for mistakes. The drive back to Steel Oil headquarters was quiet, the tension of the night still heavy between them. Dylan could barely process what had just happened. Parker had turned what seemed like a losing battle into a decisive victory with nothing more than a video, a single piece of damning evidence. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a strategist, ruthless and calculating. But as the city lights passed in a blur, Dylan felt a gnawing unease growing inside him. The deeper he was drawn into Parker's world, the more dangerous it became. The people Parker dealt with weren't just corporate rivals. They were people who could destroy lives without a second thought. And now, Dylan was right in the middle of it. As they approached Steel Oil's towering headquarters, Parker's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of something crossed his face. Concern? Doubt? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Parker answered the call, his voice sharp. "What is it?" Dylan couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could see Parker's expression darken. "Handle it," Parker snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll deal with it when I get there." He ended the call with a growl and leaned back in his seat, his jaw clenched tight. Dylan could feel the shift in the air. Something was wrong. "What's going on, sir?" Dylan asked, his voice tentative. Parker didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the skyline as they neared the heart of the city. After a moment, he finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "There's been a breach. In my company." Dylan's stomach dropped. A breach? In Steel Oil? The idea seemed impossible. Parker was always 2 steps ahead, always in control. How could anyone get past his defenses? "They got into one of the confidential systems," Parker continued, his tone hardening with every word. "It's someone on the inside. Someone close." Dylan felt a chill run through him. This was more than just a corporate setback. This was personal. Parker wasn't just fighting external enemies anymore. There was someone within his empire, someone with access to the very core of his operation, who had turned against him. "Do you know who it is?" Dylan asked cautiously. Parker's eyes flickered with a dangerous intensity. "Not yet," he said coldly, "but I will soon enough." As the car pulled into the underground garage, Parker's phone buzzed again. This time, he ignored it, his focus entirely on the growing threat. "Dylan," Parker said, his voice low and commanding, "when we get upstairs, I need you to stay close. This breach, it could be anyone, and I need to know who I can trust." Dylan nodded, though his heart raced with uncertainty. He had come into this world thinking he would learn the ropes of corporate success, but what he was now involved in was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The stakes were rising, and if Parker was right, they were about to face a threat from within. They exited the car, and Dylan followed Parker to the private elevator. As the doors closed, sealing them in, Dylan could feel the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just business anymore. This was survival. The elevator opened onto the top floor, and the stark contrast between the sleek, modern office and the looming danger sent a wave of unease through Dylan. They stepped into Parker's vast office, the lights automatically flickering on as they entered. The room was empty, save for the ever-present digital wall displaying the company's data streams. Parker walked to his desk and sat down, his fingers drumming impatiently against the polished wood as he stared at the array of screens in front of him. "Pull up the security feed," he ordered, his voice taut with tension. Dylan watched as Parker's assistant, a woman named Emily, appeared on one of the screens. "Sir," she greeted him with a respectful nod. "I've been monitoring the situation closely. The breach originated from a restricted access point. Only a handful of people have clearance to that level." Parker's eyes darkened. "Who?" Emily hesitated, her expression tightening. "The list includes your top executives, IT personnel, and a few personal staff members. But the signature suggests it was someone with deeper clearance." someone who had direct access to the most sensitive information, Dylan shifted uncomfortably. He didn't have direct access to Steel Oil's core systems, but he had seen enough to know that only a few people held that kind of clearance. And whoever they were, they had to be someone Parker trusted. "Get me a name," Parker demanded, his voice icy. Emily nodded. "I'll have it within the hour, sir." "But," she trailed off, her expression conflicted. "But what?" Parker snapped, his patience wearing thin. Emily swallowed hard before continuing. "The breach wasn't just an external leak. Whoever did this didn't just steal information. They planted something. We're still trying to trace it, but it looks like malware. Something designed to destroy your entire system from the inside." Parker's face went pale, his calm exterior cracking for the first time. "What?" Emily nodded grimly. "If we don't shut it down soon, Steel Oil could lose everything. Financial records, contracts, proprietary data. It's all at risk." Dylan's heart pounded in his chest as the gravity of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a leak. It was sabotage. And whoever was behind it had set in motion a plan to bring down Steel Oil from within. Parker stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "Shut it down. Now." "We're working on it, sir," Emily assured him. "But it's sophisticated. Whoever did this knew exactly where to strike." Parker's gaze turned murderous. "And when I find out who it is, they'll wish they'd never been born." Dylan stood frozen, watching Parker pace the room like a caged predator. The man who had always seemed unshakable was now on the verge of losing control, and Dylan couldn't help but feel the creeping dread that came with it. If Steel Oil fell, everything Parker had built would collapse, and everyone associated with him, Dylan included, would be caught in the fallout. After what felt like an eternity, Emily's voice crackled through the intercom again. "Sir, we've traced the source. The breach originated from a terminal registered to." She paused, and Parker's expression turned dark. "To who?" he demanded. "To Jackson," Emily said quietly. "Jackson Ward." Dylan's stomach dropped at the name. Jackson Ward was Parker's head of IT, a man who had been with Steel Oil for over a decade, overseeing the company's entire cybersecurity infrastructure. He was the last person anyone would suspect, loyal, intelligent, and fiercely protective of Parker's empire. But now, it seemed he was the one responsible for the attack. Parker's face twisted in fury. "Where is he?" Emily's voice was steady, but there was an edge of fear in it. "We've locked down his terminal, but he's not in his office. We believe he's still in the building." Parker's eyes blazed. "Find him. Now." Dylan's mind raced. Jackson? The quiet, unassuming man who had always been a fixture in the company's operations? It didn't make sense. But then again, nothing about this world was as it seemed. Parker turned to Dylan, his expression grim. "Come with me." They moved quickly through the corridors, the tension mounting with every step. Dylan could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just about stopping a breach anymore. This was about betrayal, about revenge. As they approached the IT department, they found it deserted, the lights dimmed. The silence was unsettling. Emily's voice crackled over the intercom again. "He's on the 17th floor, sir. Security is closing in." Parker's eyes narrowed as they headed for the nearest stairwell, bypassing the elevators for speed. They descended quickly, each step bringing them closer to the man who had tried to destroy Steel Oil from the inside. When they reached the 17th floor, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. Dylan's heart raced as they rounded the corner, only to find Jackson Ward standing near a server room door, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. Parker stopped cold, his gaze locking onto the man who had betrayed him. "Jackson," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself." Jackson's hands shook as he looked between Parker and Dylan, his voice trembling. I didn't have a choice, Parker." "You don't understand." Parker's eyes narrowed, his voice low and dangerous. "Then make me understand." Jackson swallowed hard, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. They threatened my family. They said they'd kill them if I didn't do it. They said they'd make it look like an accident." Parker took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Who?" Jackson shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. I don't know who they are. I've never met them. They contacted me through encrypted channels, sent people to watch my house. I had no choice, Parker. Please, you have to believe me. Dylan stood frozen, his mind reeling. The betrayal was deeper than they had imagined, and now it wasn't just about money or power. It was about life and death. Parker's expression remained cold, unfeeling. You sold me out. You put everything at risk. And for what? Jackson collapsed to his knees, sobbing. I'm sorry. I didn't want to do it. I swear. But they'll come for my family. They'll come for me. Parker's face twisted in disgust as he looked down at Jackson. You made your choice, Jackson. Now you'll have to live with it. With that, Parker turned to Dylan, his voice steely. Call Emily. Tell her to lock him in here. We'll deal with him later. As Dylan reached for his phone, Jackson's desperate voice echoed through the hallway. Please, Parker. Please, I didn't have a choice. But Parker was already walking away, his back turned to the man who had once been his most trusted ally. Dylan followed, his hands shaking as he dialed Emily's number, the weight of everything crushing down on him. And as they ascended the stairs, Parker's cold, quiet voice cut through the silence. Trust no one, Dylan. Not even yourself. Dylan's footsteps echoed in the quiet stairwell as they ascended back to the top floor, the weight of Jackson's betrayal still heavy in his mind. The man's tearful pleas, his broken sobs about his family, rang in Dylan's ears. It had all felt so raw, so real. But Parker hadn't flinched, hadn't shown even a shred of mercy. Lock him in here. We'll deal with him later. Parker's words echoed in Dylan's mind as they reached the upper floor, the doors swinging open with a soft click. This was the world Parker lived in, where betrayal was met with cold, unfeeling punishment, no matter the reasons behind it. They entered Parker's office once again, the vast space seeming even more imposing in the stillness of the night. Parker moved toward his desk, his face unreadable, and Dylan stood near the doorway, unsure of what to do next. Sir, Dylan ventured, his voice quiet. What if Jackson was telling the truth? What if his family really is in danger? Parker didn't respond immediately. He sat down, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he considered Dylan's question. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the digital wall displaying Steel Oil's real-time data, the numbers flickering endlessly across the screens. Finally, Parker spoke, his voice cold and measured. It doesn't matter. Dylan blinked, taken aback. What do you mean? He said they threatened his family. I know what he said, Parker interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. And it doesn't matter. He made his choice the moment he put my company at risk. Dylan stood there, frozen by the finality in Parker's words. It wasn't that Parker didn't believe Jackson. He simply didn't care. Loyalty, trust, even the threat of death. It all took a back seat to Steel Oil's survival. Dylan had known that Parker was ruthless, but this was something else entirely. Parker continued, his gaze locked on Dylan. This is the world we live in, Dylan. People will come after you from every angle. Some will try to manipulate you, play the victim, tell you sob stories to get you to lower your guard. But you can't afford to care, because the moment you do, the moment you let sympathy guide your decisions, you lose. Dylan felt a chill run down his spine as Parker's words sank in. So, what are you going to do with Jackson? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Parker's eyes darkened. He's a liability. I'll handle him. Dylan's stomach twisted. He didn't need Parker to spell it out. Jackson's betrayal wouldn't go unpunished, and in Parker's world, punishments were absolute. There was no forgiveness here, no second chances. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Dylan could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. Jackson's betrayal, Parker's cold resolve, the dangerous game they were playing. For the first time since joining Steel Oil, he wondered if he was in over his head. Suddenly, Parker's phone buzzed on the desk, shattering the silence. He glanced at it, his expression hardening as he read the message. It's Emily, Parker said, his voice sharp. They've neutralized the malware, but not before it did some damage. Our financial records are intact, But there are gaps in our contracts. Someone got to them. Dylan felt his chest tighten. What does that mean? Parker stood, pacing the length of the room. It means we're vulnerable. Contracts, deals. Everything we've built could be used against us if they've gotten into the wrong hands. He turned to Dylan, his eyes blazing with intensity. We need to find out who's behind this. Dylan nodded, though his mind raced with uncertainty. Whoever had forced Jackson to betray Parker clearly had access to powerful resources. This wasn't just a random attack. It was calculated, precise, designed to bring Steel Oil to its knees. And if they didn't move quickly, Parker's empire could crumble. What do we do next? Dylan asked, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. Parker's jaw clenched as he stared out the window, the Houston skyline glittering in the distance. We start by following the money. Whoever is behind this, they'll have left a trail. A deal like this doesn't happen without someone funding it. He turned back to Dylan, his eyes narrowing. And we're going to find out who they are. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Parker's team was mobilized immediately, poring over financial records, tracing payments, and searching for any connection to the breach. Dylan watched as Parker orchestrated everything, his commands sharp and precise, his focus unyielding. The office hummed with quiet efficiency as the investigation unfolded. Dylan had never seen anything like it. Parker had a way of controlling the room, of directing his team like a general preparing for war. It was a side of him Dylan had only glimpsed before, but now it was on full display. As the hours dragged on, Dylan found himself in the quiet corner of the room, watching the screens flash with data, contracts, and figures. His mind drifted back to Jackson. Had he really betrayed Parker out of fear for his family? Or was there more to the story? Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on, something that Parker hadn't seen yet, or perhaps refused to see. Suddenly, one of the analysts let out a quiet curse, her eyes widening as she stared at her screen. "Sir," she called, her voice urgent. "We've got something." Parker was by her side in an instant, his eyes scanning the data on the screen. Dylan moved closer, his heart pounding. "It's a shell company," the analyst said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Hidden deep in the contract records, tied to one of our smaller oil fields. Someone's been funneling money through it. Large sums, transferred out in small increments, but the pattern is clear." Parker's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. "Who's behind it?" The analyst hesitated, pulling up another set of documents. "It's registered offshore, sir, but the ownership trail leads back to Whitman Holdings." Dylan's breath caught in his throat. Whitman. Roger Whitman, the man Parker had confronted only hours ago. The man who had already betrayed Parker once. Parker's face turned to stone. "Roger." The room fell into a tense silence as the revelation sank in. Roger Whitman hadn't just been plotting against Parker during their earlier meeting. He had been behind the breach, behind the attack on Steel Oil's very foundation. It all made sense now. The way Roger had hinted at new players entering the game, the veiled threats, the power struggle that had been brewing beneath the surface. "He's been planning this for months," Parker muttered, his voice barely controlled. "All that talk about new alliances, disruptors. He wasn't warning me. He was telling me." Dylan could hardly believe it. Roger Whitman, one of Parker's longest-serving executives, a man who had helped build Steel Oil from the ground up, was the mastermind behind the attack. "What do we do now, sir?" one of the analysts asked, her voice quiet. Parker's eyes blazed with fury as he turned to face the room. "We stop him," he said coldly. "We stop him before he can do any more damage." The next move was swift and decisive. Parker's team began dismantling Roger's network, tracing every financial transaction, every contract, every dirty deal he had orchestrated. It was a meticulous process, and as the hours wore on, Dylan could see the scope of Roger's betrayal growing larger with every new piece of information uncovered. But as the night dragged on, Parker's anger only seemed to intensify. He wasn't just cleaning up a corporate mess, he was preparing for war. And Dylan could see the toll it was taking on him. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Parker called Dylan into his private office. The door closed behind them, sealing them off from the chaos outside. Parker sat behind his desk, his expression hard and unyielding. "We're going after Roger. But this time, it won't just be about shutting down his operation. It's going to be personal." Dylan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Parker leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "He's gone too far. He didn't just attack Steel Oil. He came after me. He thought he could outmaneuver me, tear down everything I built. But he's about to learn what happens when you push me too far." Dylan's breath caught in his throat. He had seen Parker angry before, but this was different. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was vengeance. "And you?" Parker continued, his gaze locking onto Dylan. "You're going to help me finish this." Dylan felt the weight of Parker's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. He had come to Steel Oil hoping to learn, to be mentored by one of the most powerful men in the world. But now, he was being drawn deeper into a world of betrayal and revenge. A world where there were no rules, no limits, only survival. "I'm with you, sir," Dylan said, though his voice trembled slightly. Parker nodded, his eyes never leaving Dylan's. "Good, because from here on out, things are going to get very dangerous." As Dylan left Parker's office, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. This wasn't just about saving Steel Oil anymore. It wasn't even about protecting Parker's empire. It was about destroying anyone who dared to stand in Parker Steel's way. The sun barely peeked over the Houston skyline as Dylan paced the hallway outside Parker's office. His heart raced, his thoughts a tangled web of fear and excitement. He had thrown his lot in with Parker, and now there was no turning back. This was no longer just about business or ambition. He was part of Parker's personal war, a war that would leave scars on everyone involved. The door to Parker's office opened, and Parker stepped out, his eyes sharp, his presence commanding. He was dressed in a tailored suit, every bit the oil tycoon he had always been, but the tension in his face told a different story. He was a man preparing for battle. "Let's go," Parker said, his voice low but firm. Dylan fell in step beside him as they made their way toward the private elevator that would take them down to the garage. The plan was already in motion. Parker had been working all night, pulling strings, gathering resources, and preparing to confront Roger Whitman once and for all. But this wouldn't be some polite conversation in a boardroom. This was going to be brutal. As they descended, the silence between them felt heavy. Dylan's mind raced with possibilities. Roger had been one of Parker's closest allies, someone he had trusted for years. The betrayal ran deep, and now Dylan was beginning to understand just how personal this had become. Roger hadn't just tried to destroy Steel Oil. He had come for Parker's legacy, his very soul. The elevator doors opened to the underground garage, where one of Parker's cars, a sleek, black sedan, was waiting. Parker slid into the back seat, motioning for Dylan to join him. Once inside, the driver sped off, and the tension in the car grew thicker with every passing moment. Dylan glanced at Parker, who was staring out the window, his jaw clenched tight. He had never seen the man like this, so focused, so dangerously calm. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet resolve of a man who was prepared to do whatever it took to win. "Sir," Dylan ventured, unsure of how to ask the question burning in his mind. "What exactly are we going to do?" Parker's eyes flicked toward him, cold and calculating. "We're going to make Roger an offer he can't refuse." Dylan's stomach tightened. He had seen enough of Parker's ruthless side to know that this offer wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be a final ultimatum, one that would likely end with Roger's downfall, one way or another. The car wove through the streets of Houston, heading toward an upscale neighborhood where Roger owned a sprawling estate. As they neared the gated entrance, the car slowed, and Parker leaned forward. "Wait here," he instructed the driver. They stepped out into the cool morning air, the gates creaking open before them. Dylan followed Parker down the long, winding driveway that led to Roger's mansion. The house was as grand as expected, tall, elegant, with perfectly manicured lawns. But today, it felt like a fortress about to fall. They reached the front door, and before Dylan could even process what was happening, Parker rang the doorbell, his expression steely. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing Roger Whitman. His face paled slightly at the sight of Parker, but he quickly recovered, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Parker," Roger said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Parker didn't smile. He stepped forward, his presence suffocating, and his eyes locked onto Roger's with the intensity of a predator. "We need to talk." Roger's smirk faltered, and he stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Dylan followed Parker inside, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the air in the room was thick with tension, the unspoken weight of everything that had led them to this moment. They entered Roger's lavish sitting room, where expensive art lined the walls and designer furniture filled the space. It was a far cry from the gritty oil fields where Steel Oil had begun, but it was clear that Roger had enjoyed the fruits of his betrayal. He had already started living like a man on the rise, even before Parker had fallen. "Can I get you something to drink?" Roger asked, his voice overly polite, a facade of civility masking the malice beneath. Parker ignored the question and sat down in one of the plush chairs, his expression never wavering. Dylan stood behind him, unsure of what to do with his hands, the tension between the two men almost unbearable. "Let's cut the bullshit, Roger," Parker said flatly. "You've been siphoning money out of my company for months. You sabotaged our contracts. And you think you're going to walk away from this?" Roger's smile faded entirely now. He stood across from Parker, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't sabotage anything, Parker. I'm making moves, just like you taught me." Parker's eyes flashed with fury, but his voice remained calm. "You betrayed me. You tried to destroy everything I built." Roger's face twisted into something darker, something more dangerous. "You built this empire by stepping on everyone who ever trusted you. You think I didn't see that? You think I didn't learn from the best?" Dylan felt a chill run through him. The tension in the room was electric, and he knew that they were only moments away from something explosive. Roger wasn't backing down, and Parker wasn't about to let him off easy. Parker leaned forward, his eyes boring into Roger's. "This is your last chance, Roger. Walk away. Take what's left of your fortune and disappear. If you don't, I'll ruin you. Completely." Roger's lips curled into a sneer. "Ruin me? You're already finished, Parker. I've got everything I need to take Steel Oil from you. The board is turning. The investors are ready to back me. You're old news." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. Was it true? Had Roger already outmaneuvered Parker? The thought sent a wave of panic through him. If Roger was right, then everything Parker had fought for was already gone. But Parker didn't flinch. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Roger's. "You've always underestimated me," Parker said quietly. "That's your biggest mistake. You think you can walk away from this and be safe? You think your new allies will protect you?" Roger said nothing, his expression hardening. Parker stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Let me tell you what's going to happen, Roger. Your friends, those new investors you're so proud of, they're going to disappear. And you know why? Because I'm going to make sure every dirty deal you ever made, every skeleton in your closet, comes out for the world to see. You won't just lose Steel Oil, you'll lose everything. Your money, your reputation, your freedom." Roger's face drained of color, and for the first time, Dylan saw fear flicker in his eyes. Parker leaned in, his voice barely audible now. "And then, when you have nothing left, when you're begging for scraps, I'll be there, watching." The silence that followed was deafening. Roger stood frozen, his hands gripping the back of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was cornered, and he knew it. "You have 24 hours, Parker said, his voice cold and final. "Disappear, or I'll destroy you." Without another word, Parker turned and walked out, leaving Roger standing in the wreckage of his own ambitions. Dylan hurried to follow, his heart racing as they stepped back into the morning light. As they got into the car, Dylan could hardly believe what had just happened. Parker hadn't needed threats of violence or schemes. He had won with words alone, with the sheer force of his presence. He had outmaneuvered Roger not with money, but with fear. The car sped away from Roger's mansion, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Parker stared out the window, his expression unreadable, while Dylan tried to process everything. Finally, Dylan broke the silence. Do you think he'll leave? Parker didn't turn to look at him, his voice as cold as ever. He'll leave. He has no choice. Dylan nodded, though a part of him still felt uneasy. This victory hadn't come without a cost. Parker might have outplayed Roger, but it was clear now that the world around Steel Oil was filled with people just waiting to take Parker down. And Dylan knew, deep in his gut, that this wouldn't be the last fight. As the city loomed ahead of them, Dylan realized something else. He was no longer just a driver, no longer just an ambitious kid trying to learn the ropes. He was now Parker's right hand, and that meant he was part of everything, the good and the bad, the victories, the betrayals, the war for power. And as Parker's world grew darker, so too would Dylan's. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Parker sat behind his desk, bathed in the faint glow of the Houston skyline, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Across from him, Dylan stood with clenched hands, heart pounding under the weight of everything that had happened. This was the moment. Betrayals, threats, and ruthless decisions had led to this. Roger Whitman had been given an ultimatum. Parker had been confident he'd flee, disappearing into obscurity. But when Parker's phone buzzed that evening, everything changed. "They've called an emergency board meeting," Parker said coldly, tossing the phone onto his desk. Dylan's stomach tightened. "Tonight?" Parker nodded, his eyes dark. "Roger's making his move. He's not running. He thinks he can take Steel Oil from me right here, right now." Roger wasn't just any executive. He had been with Parker from the beginning and knew the company inside out. With the board already wavering after the sabotage, it wouldn't take much to tip the scales in Roger's favor. "What do we do?" Dylan asked quietly. Parker stood, adjusting his suit, calm and controlled. "We fight." The boardroom buzzed with hushed anticipation as Parker and Dylan entered. Board members sat in their usual seats, but the tension was unmistakable. Roger sat at the far end of the table, eyes gleaming with confidence, not even bothering to acknowledge Parker's entrance. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about corporate control. It was about Parker's legacy. Roger's betrayal had cut deep, but if he won tonight, it would end everything Parker had built. Parker took his seat, face calm, unreadable. The board exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard rumors, Roger's growing influence, Parker's supposed decline. Now, they were here to decide who would lead Steel Oil. Roger stood first, his voice smooth and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the numbers. Parker's leadership has been effective, but we're in a new era. The energy sector is changing, and we need someone who can adapt, someone to lead Steel Oil into the future." His words lingered, and the board murmured in agreement. Dylan felt the momentum shifting toward Roger. "I've secured new investors, new alliances," Roger continued, confidence rising. "With the right leadership, we can expand beyond anything we've ever imagined. But that requires change." He finally looked at Parker, eyes filled with triumph. "It's time to move on." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dylan's heart raced as he watched Parker, waiting for a response. But Parker remained still, seemingly unaffected. Finally, Parker stood. "I've heard this before, Roger," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Every few years, someone like you comes along, thinking they can take what I've built." Parker began walking slowly around the table, locking eyes with each board member. Steel Oil wasn't built on investors or promises of change. It was built on grit, hard work, and loyalty. He stopped beside Charles, one of the senior board members. "Charles, do you remember drilling in West Texas? Striking that first well?" Charles nodded, nostalgia softening his expression. "I remember, Parker. It was hell. The equipment was outdated, the land unforgiving, and everyone told us we were wasting our time. But we didn't quit. And that's why we're here today." Parker's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Steel Oil isn't just a company. It's a legacy, the product of years of sacrifice. Yes, the world is changing, but if you think the answer is to discard everything we've built, you don't understand what Steel Oil truly is." Roger's expression faltered, though he held his ground. "This is about the future, Parker." Parker's eyes narrowed. "No, Roger. This is about you. You thought you could steal my company. But Steel Oil doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to everyone in this room. Turning to the board, Parker's voice was resolute. You've seen what Steel Oil can accomplish under the right leadership. And I'm telling you now, I'm not done. We will adapt, grow, and emerge stronger than ever. The room was silent as Parker's words settled. Dylan sensed the shift, the board members' loyalty slowly returning to Parker. Charles spoke first. Parker's right. We've faced tough times before and always come out stronger. I vote we keep him as CEO. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Roger's confidence crumbled as the board voiced their support for Parker. No, Roger muttered, shaking his head. You're making a mistake. But it was too late. The vote was cast, and Parker had won. Roger stood, fury twisting his face. This isn't over, Parker. You may have won today, but you can't stop what's coming. Parker didn't flinch. It's already over, Roger. You just don't realize it yet. Roger stormed out, leaving behind the wreckage of his failed coup. The board breathed a collective sigh of relief as Parker's expression softened for the first time that night. Thank you, Parker said quietly. I won't let you down. As the meeting adjourned, Dylan stayed behind, heart still racing. Parker approached, a faint smile on his face. You did good, kid, Parker said, clapping Dylan's shoulder. Dylan exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax. I wasn't sure what would happen. Parker chuckled softly. Neither was I. They stood in the empty boardroom for a moment, the weight of victory settling. Dylan had been through so much with Parker, witnessed his darkest moments. But now, there was relief. What happens next? Dylan asked. We rebuild, Parker said, his smile widening. And we make sure no one ever tries to take this from us again. As they left the boardroom, walking side by side into the future, Dylan knew one thing for sure. He had found his place in Parker Steele's world. Together, they were unstoppable.